But something else seems to be happening as well. One natural force or clue which appears to have exactly the opposite properties is natural selection. Instead of naturally descending into chaos or decay, or being prevented by some unknown force from doing so, it appears to have a tendency to survive at all costs. So you could argue that all living systems have an inbuilt drive to regenerate. And when I say all living systems, I mean all. All living organisms and all forms of vegetation, the self-replicating cell is a built-in engine driving the whole system. There have been dozens of global devastations and several mass extinctions since the beginning of life on Earth, and before humans even appeared. But no amount of chaos appears to reverse this process. Was the supernatural applying his own global experiment to see whether life could be wiped out permanently? Are humans just pawns in a huge supernatural game of life? Is the self-replicating cell a clue to regeneration and therefore resurrection? What are all these clues trying to tell us? Probably this: that the supernatural is not required. But if you have listened to part 1 of this talk, you'll remember that we have already established one major point and one minor point about the supernatural. The major one is that God is not interested in evidence, and the lesser one is that he does leave a lot of clues around. For example, the Bible confirms that all these natural processes do not need God to be here anyway. I repeat, the supernatural could very well exist, but has deliberately chosen to be absent at this particular time in the world's history. In case you have forgotten my evidence or clue for that statement, here it is again. Matthew 21. There was a landowner who planted a vineyard. He put a wall around it, dug a winepress in it, and built a watchtower. Then he rented the vineyard to some farmers and went away on a journey. And here is a different parable with the same message. Matthew 25. Again it will be like a man going on a journey, who called his servants and entrusted his property to them. To one he gave 5 talents of money, to another 2 talents, and to another 1 talent, each according to his ability. Then he went on his journey. The man who had received the 5 talents went at once and put his money to work and gained 5 more. So also the one with the 2 talents gained 2 more. But the man who had received the 1 talent went off, dug a hole in the ground and hid his master's money. After a long time, the master of those servants returned and settled accounts with them. In other words, the chances are very high that what we see in nature and in the cosmos has been set up in the first place to survive on its own, without any outside interference. And the chances are high because it appears that religion and science agree about absence. But what about the opposite forces, where everything tends to chaos and the world appears to be descending into self-destruction? Is the invisible clue that the supernatural is keeping some sort of balance? Well, I have no wish to create a scenario where God has left planet Earth on its own, but now and again orders another supernatural agent, such as an angel or two, to tweak a few knobs and dials in the universal playground of life and physical laws, so that something imperceptible happens which nobody notices, or that physical laws which would otherwise descend into chaos are prevented from descending into chaos. But that really does appear to be what is going on. And what would those imperceptible changes be exactly? The changes which nobody notices. The hidden clues at the crime scene. For example, we never hear about the following. The flood that never happened. The world is besieged with disasters ranging from earthquakes to tsunamis, from droughts to crop failures, from epidemics to mass starvation. But we never hear about the disaster that never happened. The asteroid that could have knocked Earth sideways, but went somewhere else. The hole in the ozone layer that could have become larger, but didn't. The pandemic which never broke out. The nuclear war which was averted. The list goes on and may seem a pointless exercise until you look at this slightly differently. Let's just assume that you have an ordinary average life with ordinary average health and an ordinary average job, with an ordinary average family, living in an ordinary average house, and so on. This will apply to virtually every person who listens to this video, including myself. Have you ever noticed that something is missing? No, of course you haven't. Have you ever noticed that something should have happened, but hasn't happened? No, of course you haven't. Well, I can assure you that there is something there, because with all due respect to yourself, you have not reached a stage of enlightenment to know about it. For example, if something were to happen which affects just one of those ordinary average things, say for example you were made redundant and you couldn't find another job and had to go on benefits, the most likely thing to happen would be that you or your partner, husband or wife would look for something or someone to blame. Did that something or someone exist before you lost your job? Of course it did, but you had no reason to believe it was there, because your ordinary average life, ordinary average health, job, family, house and everything else was just, well, normal and average, and all taken for granted. So if you now read this statement, you will probably understand it. Let me illustrate this with another scenario. During the winter of 2013-14, thousands of normal average people lost their homes in the floods which devastated Somerset and the south coast of Britain. I can guarantee that they blamed either the Environment Agency for not maintaining the rivers, or the supernatural for not controlling the weather. Did the Environment Agency, or God, exist before the disaster or not? Of course they did. So why wasn't everybody thanking the Environment Agency for a normal average day without floods, or thanking God for a normal average home without having to live upstairs without electricity or water, or a normal average family, job and so on? Simply because everyone takes all these normal things for granted and doesn't give them another thought. But is it right? Looked at from the point of view that 50% of the world is living in poverty, you would have to answer no. It isn't right to take things for granted. This is why Jesus taught that wealth was to be avoided. Mark chapter 10. One thing you lack, Jesus said, go sell everything you have and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come, follow me. At this the man's face fell. He went away sad, because he had great wealth. Jesus looked around and said to his disciples, how hard it is for the rich to enter the kingdom of God. It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. You will perhaps understand now why I talked a few minutes ago about the disasters which never happened, or the nuclear war which was averted, I hear people complaining about a cruel God when they suffer personally, or when suffering happens on a massive scale. But I never hear the same people praising God for an ordinary average life, with ordinary average health and job and family and so on. The God of grace and mercy in the ordinary average day is completely missed, in the same way as the God who may well have sent the asteroid on a slightly different course is missed. This will probably still be a difficult concept for most people. So let's go back to the scenario which I described in part 1. You are sat in the hospital in the children's ward, and you have just received the news that your child is never going to recover from the illness which he or she has. Why do your thoughts inevitably turn to God, suffering, heaven, and even possible afterlife? And why, until that point in time, have your thoughts never turned to God about any other things? In a word, why has God not existed until that point in time? So the invisible adjusting of the knobs and dials of the universe may well not be the science fiction that we thought it was. The principle is just the same as what I established in part 1. Look for the clues and start thinking for yourself, and maybe, just maybe, you may reach a form of spiritual enlightenment which I described just a moment ago. It is also remarkable that nearly 2,000 years ago the Apostle Paul knew that something wasn't quite right about the knobs and dials of the universe, even though it was 2,000 years ago. He wrote this, Romans chapter 8. For the creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the glorious freedom of the children of God. We know that the whole creation has been groaning, as in the pains of childbirth, right up to the present time. So everything which nobody notices must be the most understated phenomenon of existence. But what has it to do with the resurrection? Simply this: have you noticed how understated the resurrection was at the time it happened? No voices thundering from heaven, no earthquakes or floods in Jerusalem, no army of angels marching up to the tomb and overpowering the Roman guard. Why? For the same reason as nobody thanks God for anything. Just because hardly anybody noticed the resurrection doesn't mean it never happened. And you now know that the fact that it went almost unnoticed at the time is the key to the fact that it most likely did happen.